Well, I'd like to welcome everyone. I wanted to be sure everyone had an opportunity to get food, and it appears as if the food line has disappeared, so we'll begin to get started. My name is Blair Rubel, and I'm director of the Wilson Center's new program on global sustainability and resilience. And it includes within it three of the sponsoring programs for today's event: the Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population and Security, or HELPS, and the Comparative Urban Studies Project, known in-house as CUSP. And in addition to these programs, we've worked with our colleagues in the Center's Africa program and with the Women's Refugee Commission to make this event possible. Now, underlying all the reality of those acronyms is that there's several people who helped out, but there's one primary mover in the meeting, and it's Sandeep Bathala, and I want to acknowledge her presence and thank her. She is the Senior Program Associate for the Environmental Change and Security Program and Global Health Initiative, and is really the prime mover of our HELPS project, which is a 5-year initiative funded by the Population Office at USAID. So I want to thank her. I want to thank everybody who's been involved in making this meeting possible. The meeting is an important and a timely one. Obviously, you know the title, Tapping the Potential of Displaced Youth in Urban Settings. And it's a timely one because just in the past couple of days, there have been a couple of significant reports which begin to highlight why the issue of displaced youth in urban settings matters to people. The first is just this week, the National Intelligence Council released its Global Trends 2030 report. And as my former colleague Jeff DeBelco puts it, it's not your father's Global Trends report. It focuses very heavily on demographic issues and on technological change and how those forces are going to shape the world. And it moves away from what once was thought of as the traditional emphasis in national security on, well, part of the world I used to deal with the Soviet Union, it was always throwawaits and missile heads, strategic missiles and so on, nuclear warheads and so on and so forth. Specifically in the demography section of the Global Trends report, it highlights aging societies, youthful societies, migration and urbanization as profound demographic trends that will shape the security landscape and shape how we all live between now and 2030. And 3 of those 4 trends are trends this meeting is about. The other major report that came out recently, I highly recommend for those of you who are interested in Africa and in children. Save the Children last week released a really excellent report on the impact of urban growth on children in Africa. And if you have any interest in these subjects, go to their website and find it online. It's a very important landmark report. So we have an important topic, and we also have 3 speakers who are better placed than many people, if not all other people. I won't quite go that far. There's always somebody out there, but these are 3 very well-placed speakers to talk about these issues. Josh, you have the bios, I believe, but Josh is Senior Program Officer for Economic Strengthening and Child Protection, the Women's Refugee Commission. Celine is Project Manager for Don Bosco in India, and Nicole is Senior Program Officer for UNHCR and Gender, Child, and Youth Issues of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the Department of State. Together, they'll highlight a number of successful interventions in India, Panama, Kenya, and Egypt, and they'll make recommendations to donor agencies, UN agencies, and NGOs. And I don't want to say too much about them because you have the information, but I'll just mention that Josh leads a global task force on economic strengthening and child protection, and a subnetwork of the Columbia University-led Child Protection in Crisis CPC network. He previously worked for UNICEF at headquarters and in Nairobi, and he holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia. Nicole helps formulate and coordinate U.S. policy and strategic planning on gender, children, and youth-related activities. She also works on implementation of U.S. government policies and policy priorities for refugee women and children. She has extensive experience in designing, monitoring, and evaluating programs focusing on care and protection of refugee women and children. She did her graduate work at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's a former presidential management fellow. And Selene has been working in the field of social work for over a decade. She has an MBA in human resource management, and she's been working with Don Bosco for, over a decade. So for a long time. So I hope I've convinced you that these are three people you have to listen to, and even if I haven't, they will. So I will now turn the floor over to them.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much to the Wilson Center and to Sandeep especially for inviting us and making us comfortable. I'm going to talk about a one-year project that was funded by BPRM. So thanks to BPRM, where we went and talked to youth in Panama City, in Nairobi, and in Cairo. And when I say youth, we've defined it as 15 to 24. This was about, we got into this work because we did a similar exercise a couple of years ago looking at urban livelihoods, urban refugee livelihoods, not specifically looking at youth, and found that youth was the glaring gap, that we couldn't find hardly any good programming for youth, and there was just so little known about it. So it's just a major gap in knowledge and programming for refugee youth living in cities. So what do we do about it? We did a very comprehensive literature review over a period of about a year, and then we did the 3 field assessments where we ended up talking to about 250 young people in focus groups that are stratified by age and sex, and a lot of individual interviews with young people, and then key informant interviews with all the agencies, all the stakeholders working on these issues. And visits to work sites and that kind of thing. We got into this work, our philosophy going into this is that, and we all hear about the youth bulge all the time, the demographic youth bulge that's exploding all over the world, and it's seen as a security threat, and to the extent that this kind of programming gets funded at all for youth, it's usually because of some kind of, for security reasons. But we firmly believe that when education, healthcare, basic needs are met for young people and they have employment opportunities, that they can revitalize the economy, that they are, in many cases in these countries, kind of the main resource that the country has, if we can tap into it. I'm going to talk a lot about various forms of oppression and deprivation, but I want to start on a positive note and say that the city presents a lot of opportunities for young people and working with young people, that opportunities that they don't necessarily have in a camp setting or in a rural setting. The city, you've got private firms, you've got access to productive technologies, access to potentially to continuing education, to internships, to mentorship, apprenticeship, that kind of thing. And also, we have a self-selected group among refugee youth living in cities because they're, by nature of having arrived in the city, many of them are more entrepreneurial, more self-starting than the general population where they came from, and even in the host country where they've landed. Our main findings are, well, the main finding is that there is enormous potential for empowering young people living in cities, refugees living in cities, and we're not doing it. I mean, we're going to hear an example today from Celine about some amazing work that they're doing, but sadly, that's the exception. There isn't a lot of good programming for these demographics. Most young people are contributing to their household in some way. Most of them have multiple daily simultaneous hustles, basically, that they do for money. They're very time poor, and they don't often have time to earn money and learn at the same time. The money that they do make is generally insufficient, and the work that they do, it tends to be unsafe also. The 800-pound gorilla of issues in the urban refugee settings that we visited is adolescent girls, especially, and young women who work as domestic workers. They tell us that they face various types of exploitation and abuse. They often don't get paid, or they get paid very poorly. Their rights are trampled on, and this is a really difficult demographic to work with. And I wish I could quantify it. I don't know how many there are in the world, but there are many tens of thousands in the cities that we went to. I'll talk about the ecosystem that they live in, and then I'll talk about the assets that young people bring and that we can hopefully try to build. In the policy realm, the 2009 UNHCR urban refugee policy is, in general, is a great thing, but it's not being implemented. Governments still routinely restrict the right to work, freedom of movement. In Nairobi, when I was there this year, as I was there, the national government basically made it illegal to work a wage job if you're a foreign national. So that's the context that we're talking about. The services that are provided to young people are generally more appropriate for a camp setting. A lot of the staff that work on urban refugee issues, since this is kind of a new thing for these agencies, they tend to be people who came from camp settings and are sort of trying to get used to the urban setting. Police are generally overzealous and very much suspicious of foreigners. The police problem is probably the number one thing that young people mention as a challenge to their daily life. And related to this, local laws, so municipal laws and neighborhood laws, and not even laws or bylaws, but just neighborhood customs, tend to restrict refugees' ability to earn a living, and I'll get into that in a minute. In the realm of security, these young people refugees in general tend to live in the least safe neighborhoods. They're daily subjected to petty crime and violence. Young women especially are at risk of gender-based violence in public spaces on a daily basis. Males in particular are at risk of recruitment into gangs. Again, the police harassment problem, lots of bribe seeking. Kids complain constantly about the fact that they don't leave the house because they don't have any money, and they don't want to be arrested because then they know they won't be able to pay a bribe to get out of jail. Their family will have to take care of it, and then it becomes an economic burden on their family. So we heard in this research that we just stay at home. We don't go anywhere. And that leads to isolation, anxiety, depression, and just generally limiting their kind of development potential. All of this adds up to major limitations on their ability to learn, to earn, and to socialize. We, like many groups, try to think of the capital assets that refugees bring. So we talk about human assets, social assets, financial, physical, and natural. Physical assets aren't really an issue for this population, and they don't have much access either to natural capital. So I'll talk about human, social, and financial capital. In the education realm, there are quite a few barriers to school. Kids complain about the cost of tuition, uniforms, that kind of the ancillary cost of education, even when education is free. Transport is a huge issue. They often complain that they live too far away from school and they can't afford to get there. Girls especially if they're coming from more traditional societies, so Ethiopian Oromo girls or Somali girls, many Somali girls will have an added constraint that there are cultural constraints on their attending school. Demand for school too seems to be pretty low. Kids are fairly unimpressed in the cities that we went to. They're fairly unimpressed with the education system. The classrooms are too packed, they say, and maybe the teachers are unmotivated. This isn't always true, though. I remember talking to one group of young men in Nairobi, Somali young men, who school was like the favorite part of their day because it's the thing they can do. They can be safe in their community. On the street, they're not really safe, but at school they can interact with other Somalis and with Kenyan nationals in a way that they can't in public. In the realm of training, we saw very few opportunities for technical vocational education and training. And even where it exists, young people just aren't aware of it. The awareness problem is glaring, not just in the training realm, but in service provision in general. Young people they're just not aware of programming that might be out there for them. Training is seen as out of date, it's too costly, it's just something that they're not necessarily all that interested in. And work readiness has been identified, not so much in this research, but Equip 3 just did a 26-country, I think, look at education and training and found that work readiness skills, or the lack thereof, is kind of the big issue, even more important than technical skills. In the realm of social capital, I mean, like any young people anywhere, they crave affiliation, and they are very aware that having useful connections with other people can help them to gain access to other kinds of capital, so human and financial capital. They come to this new context, and many times their social network has been ripped apart, and it's quite weak. Other people, I mean, it's not always the case. In some cases, their social capital has been strengthened by the fact that they're pushed together in this way with this community. In the area of financial capital, the informal market is the main option. Most refugees, especially young people, don't have access to a work permit, and in some cases they're barred from working. So if you're going to work in the informal market, you need startup capital, and startup capital, in the words of the young people we talk to, is the main barrier to their kind of economic success. They don't have any contact with banks, even informal credit or savings that we could find. There are programs for young people here and there. In general, the footprint of these programs is very, very tiny as a proportion of the need. So like UNHCR in Nairobi told me, there are 350 people more or less accessing some kind of education or training through UNHCR partners, and there are hundreds of thousands probably refugees in this setting. So you get an idea of the small footprint. Training programs are generally, where they exist, they're not necessarily, they tend to be quite short term, and they measure their success by the number of people they train instead of how good they are at connecting someone to a job. We've seen this all over the world in all of our research. We actually have Women's Commission has developed tools for doing market assessment, so you can contact me and I can get that to you. Few of the programs that do exist are designed in any kind of participatory way, and there's very little gender analysis of how can we increase demand for especially adolescent girls for these programs. So having looked at across all these contexts, we've come up with a set of what we're calling guiding principles for working with these populations. We always argue for taking a systems approach, so we want to build local capacity to deliver services rather than creating parallel systems. We want to mainstream participation in everything we do, so engaging young people as resourceful contributors to program design, to program monitoring, evaluation, etc. It's the difference between whether your program works or it doesn't. If young people aren't involved in designing, monitoring, and evaluating these programs, you're going to have worse outcomes. And the history of the humanitarian enterprise is littered with failed programs that were not participatory. We always encourage groups to infuse some kind of component of intergenerational engagement. A lot of these young people have lost the adults in their lives. Either they live apart from them now, or they are no longer living. We're always emphasizing the need for both gender mainstreaming and gender targeting. So create ambitious targets in your co-ed programming for getting women and girls involved, but then also create specific programs for young women, both of those things at the same time. Major guiding principle for this kind of work too is the need to start at the margin. So find and recruit out of school youth, disabled youth, ethnic and religious minorities, and the young people can be, you can't rely on simple demand. If you create a beautiful program and sit and wait for kids to come, you're going to get the richest, most able kids in the community that show up. So we need to engage young people to go and find their more marginalized peers and bring them in and make them feel comfortable. In the area of education, we're always encouraging groups to try to link education and economic strengthening, the two things together. These kids, many of them don't have the luxury of education for education's sake, and you can increase the demand for your programming very much by ensuring that there's some kind of short-term economic gain for them, and we could talk about ways to do that. We're always encouraging groups to take a graduated approach to poverty. We have, again, the history of the humanitarian enterprise is littered with failed programs where, what we saw in all three of these cities is when you talk to programmers, they say, so I had this group of beneficiaries and we set up a microloan program for them, and they spent all the money on their rent, or they spent all the money on food. Because they lament that they had access to some kind of funds for consumption support. So it's about figuring out what the needs are for the various strata of young people that you're addressing. Finally, I'll just mention the need to mitigate risk. So in any kind of economic programming that we do, we are meddling in people's incentives in their daily lives. And we do create risks of violence, other protection concerns, gender-based violence, and we can work to mitigate that risk. Women's Refugee Commission actually has several tools on this theme too that are on the website. If you're interested in just sort of checklists, things to think about in your economic programming, like how can we maximize the benefit and at the same time minimize the harm. Just a few recommendations to agencies. On the advocacy side, we need to continue to work on fundamental rights issues. So right to work, right to education, equal treatment to refugees of all nationalities. And as a part of that, we need better regulation of the informal market, especially the labor market for domestic workers. As I mentioned, adolescent girls as domestic workers is a major issue. It's perhaps the big issue in the urban youth refugee realm. For out-of-school youth in education, kids will need access to some kind of package of a combination of accelerated learning to online and distance learning to catch-up courses, and all of this needs to be flexible and it needs to work around their busy schedules. Their income-generating activities tend to take up a lot of time and have them running around town. So a way to make that happen is to ensure that they're participating in the program design. For in-school youth, we're interested to we need to continue to promote access to secondary and tertiary on an equal basis with host country nationals. And we also need to help them make the transition to work by adding new features to the curricula. So work readiness skills, entrepreneurship skills, career guidance services would be great. And I also want to, there's a new, maybe it's not that new, but it's new to many people, phenomenon, especially in urban areas, of low-cost private schools that we don't tend to think of when we think of school. For these populations, if you can't afford to go to regular school, you might send your kid to a cheaper alternative. And there are many, many tens of thousands of kids in these cities that attend low-cost private schools. And I think in our programming, we need to think about that and think about ways that we can reach out to those LCPSs, as they're known. In the training realm, technical vocational education and training needs to lead to increased income. It's a basic idea, but one that I think we need to remind ourselves all the time. Like this, it can't be about how many people you trained. It has to be about the degree to which you're able to connect kids to sustainable employment. Training should be linked to any national strategy for youth employment, if it exists, and it has to be done after having conducted some kind of market assessment of local demand for goods and services. And again, we have tools for this. And so Lynn's going to talk about a little bit about her experience in India with having done that. In the realm of financial capital, there's been some really nice work done, not just by Don Bosco, but IRC and other groups, on trying to work with banks to help young people open bank accounts, or at least give them the idea that they can go into a bank and be a customer of a bank, because they may not have much experience with that. In the realm of social capital, we found very, very few youth groups organically existing youth groups. So there's a lot of potential here for young people to, for groups to work with young people to create and support youth-led, youth-serving organizations. There's so much demand for this. I was in Nairobi at a youth center that's called FHOK, that's funded by the International Planned Parenthood Foundation. And I've been to a lot of youth centers in my life as part of my work, but often they're just an empty building in a village that somebody ticked the box, we have a youth center. This place, they were stacking young people up like firewood. There were so many inside, and they had it all. It was a very nice kind of multi-service facility with pool tables and a gym, so you could lift weights and training in various skills, so computer skills. You had a TV kid just sitting around watching TV. You had reproductive health education sessions. You had drama. It just ran the gamut, and it was so popular as a place for young refugee people in this neighborhood in East Lee in Nairobi. Just shows how much demand there is for a safe place to be with your friends and meet other people who share your experiences and build social capital and maybe even get some skills while you're at it. And it's such a great opportunity too for groups to engage these kids with any kind of programming that you want. So let's do more of that. We also saw a big gap in, ironically, engaging youth through sports, because sports is, maybe the number one pleasure time activity, especially for boys. It's the thing that they if I'm not at school, I'm playing soccer or I'm at home. Those were the answers we got pretty often, and yet hardly anybody's using sports. And I think there's a great deal of potential, and Celine will talk about this a little bit, for support to volunteer work, because kids want to belong to something and they want to give back. So it'd be great if we could give them more opportunities to do that, and it's a great way to build bridges between refugee and host communities as well. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
Why don't we keep going with the presentations and come back?
I don't have a PowerPoint, but I thought I would start with a pretty powerful quote from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton earlier this year, when she said, "When young people can claim their right to education and health, they increase their opportunities to become a powerful force for economic development and positive change. And I think that's a lot of what my bureau, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, is aiming to do. We focus on conflict-affected populations that are increasingly concerned with ensuring that we pay particular attention to youth and children. And for those of you who haven't heard of PRM before, we work on integrating humanitarian assistance into the State Department's overall U.S. Foreign policy. And we manage the refugee admissions program in coordination with other parts of the U.S. government. We also ensure that commitments are made, the commitments that the U.S. government has made for women, children, youth, adolescents are being incorporated into the design and the operational environment of refugee and humanitarian programs within the Department of State. We have field staff in Kampala and Kabul, Addis and Bangkok, and a few countries in between. And right now, we're working tirelessly on Syria, the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and Mali. And we represent the U.S. in international fora, where discussions are held on diverse topics, including trends and flow of migrants, fostering peace and stability, and promoting healthy and educated populations in other countries. Our approach in PRM is through international humanitarian and non-governmental organizations. So we don't actually do project implementation. We fund others to do that for us. And these organizations often have infrastructure and staff that are already in place and have the ability to deliver assistance effectively and quickly. They have trained personnel and professional personnel that are both international and local, and know the regions in which they work. Our investment is usually mostly focused on multilateral work. So over 80% of our funding, we had about a $1.8 billion budget last year. So over 80% of that goes through international organizations, and the largest being the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And we feel that these organizations leverage contributions from other donors and improves the efficiency of the international community's humanitarian response. For PRM, a central focus of our work is the idea of protection, and this doesn't mean just safety and dignity and security, but it also means enforcement and recognition of legal rights for refugees and conflict-affected populations, as well as how assistance is actually provided to those in need, and understanding the profile of those populations to ensure that the appropriate assistance is being given. Without protection integrated into assistance programming, we feel that it becomes little more than a logistics exercise with limited impact and could be very counterproductive by placing beneficiaries in greater jeopardy. So how do we fit into today's discussion? Over the past decade, PRM's populations of concern have changed dramatically. And today's refugee populations are increasingly urban. While it is difficult to gather reliable data on this, there may be over 10 million refugees and at least twice as many internally displaced persons, and I'll call them IDPs for short, in urban areas. And UNHCR estimates that 58% of refugees now reside in cities, compared to 1/3 living in camps. So as PRM, we've really had to try to refocus our efforts on not only providing assistance to refugees and conflict-affected populations in camp-based settings, but also looking at these other situations, and especially in urban cities. The trend creates new kinds of vulnerabilities and poses new protection challenges for the humanitarian community. And it also raises operational questions for us about whether and to what extent PRM and its partners should direct more attention in urban areas. In urban situations, we found that urban refugees may be viewed as just another subset of the urban poor, yet they have a much different set of needs and vulnerabilities than their contemporaries in camps. This is especially true given their lack of or different status compared to citizens of the country in which they reside. And this often places a greater burden on refugee families who may not know whether or how to access services and employment. Urban refugees often have to find a way to make it in very crowded, competitive cities where one often has to pay for services rendered, just like the other inhabitants of the city, rather than going to a refugees-only school, getting services from a refugees-focused clinic, and that has been especially established by the humanitarian community. So they're much more vulnerable in that sense. And in many humanitarian situations, adolescents and youth tend to be paid much less attention than other populations. And in urban situations, this is even more exacerbated. PRM, we've worked with a lot of partners to ensure that protection measures are in place in programming against exploitation, violence, and abuse for children, youth, and adolescents. And we have supported things like child-friendly spaces, supported education programs, both primary and secondary. We've supported livelihoods programming and psychosocial programming. On this latter issue, we feel that psychosocial programming is critical to help children and youth overcome the trauma of their experiences. And these types of services are often not available, even in urban settings. We often focus on aspects of humanitarian assistance as a humanitarian community, and we usually sort of prioritize food, shelter, water, medicine, and those issues that support sort of the physical well-being of our populations of concern. But child protection strategies, and I include youth here, build the basic physiological aspects that allow this group to maintain some semblance of a normal life and help them build a future. And those types of activities are not necessarily prioritized in humanitarian emergencies, and even midterm and long-term emergencies. PRM, earlier this year, the UN Relief Works Agency, I just want to give you an example of some of the activities that we funded for urban youth. The UNRWA announced a renewed commitment to engaging with Palestinian refugee youth at an Engaging Youth conference in Brussels. And in the past 3 years alone, my bureau has contributed close to $30 million to projects earmarked for Palestinian youth, in addition to our support as the largest bilateral donor to UNRWA's regular core programming. And some of the core programming focuses on education and other essential services for youth. And we are looking for other ways to support this youth initiative. My bureau has assisted the humanitarian community to develop and implement best practices on child protection and adolescent protection in humanitarian response. We've supported things like family tracing and reunification, have helped humanitarian partners develop new standards and guidelines, including one called Caring for Child Survivors of Sexual Abuse in humanitarian settings. We've worked with UNHCR to strengthen their best interest determination guidelines and their capacity. We've been advocates for birth registration and preventing child statelessness. And we've funded research on child and adolescent protection issues, including the Women's Refugee Commission research that you just heard about. With this research, we don't just fund research for research's sake. We actually do make sure that it's integrated and guides our programming. So we'll have several meetings with the Refugee Commission on the research that they've put together to see to find ways to be able to ensure that this is integrated in the way that we program our funding in the future. And then finally, we work very closely with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on child protection issues, adolescent and youth issues, and see how their work is actually integrated into their new protection agenda for children that they just released, and its urban refugee policy that was mentioned earlier. And on this urban refugee policy, our Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, David Robinson, this past summer took a trip with the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Janet Lim from UNHCR, to see how well UNHCR was actually operationalizing this urban policy. And they found a lot of the very similar things that you found in your research. They noted that UNHCR's urban policy addresses the right challenges and poses the right kinds of solutions, but it hasn't yet been fully communicated, translated operationally, and absorbed at the field level, meaning by UNHCR staff, and therefore it's not being really implemented as well as possible. They also noted that in the cities that they visited, I don't know if I mentioned, but it was Kampala and Addis, UNHCR sees itself as more of a service provider than as an actual advocate or facilitator, and seems to be primarily in receive mode. So come to us and we'll provide you with services, but not really going out to the population and looking at the most vulnerable and trying to sort of access or provide assistance to that group. So they haven't been proactively reaching out to vulnerable urban refugees, and this includes youth, and assessing their individual needs. UNHCR has not yet adopted innovative outreach and interventions and forged the kinds of new partnerships envisioned by the policy. And I think it was a really good idea to have this joint trip, because it wasn't just us going out and making these recommendations, but jointly we found that we had a lot of work to do. And then as a result of the trip, we proposed a number of recommendations and steps that the international community as a whole can take to improve them. One was supporting the development of universal tools at the headquarters level, meaning at the UNHCR Geneva level, that can easily be used at the local level, saving country offices from reinventing the wheel. And this could be things like having profiling data. You would think that they would have very good profiling data in terms of what types of populations they're serving. In the camps, it's much easier than to do in urban settings. And so we're now talking about trying to sort of capacitate UNHCR to look at doing a little bit more, or strengthening their profiling data in urban settings. Also strengthening some IT tools. So staff said, well, especially for example in places like Ethiopia, where there's a refugee emergency as well, we're really focusing on this refugee emergency in the Horn. We can't really be focusing a lot on urban populations. We're not set up to be case managers. So what do? Well, capacitating them with some sort of, we haven't really concretized it, but with IT, maybe cell phones or things like that, or a website where people at least can look at where the services are and access that information, and just even that would make a big difference. The other recommendation was bringing together local stakeholders for regular discussions and coordination. Surprisingly, the trip and the meetings that were set up for Dave and Janet created huge opportunities for people that had never met before to be around the table and really talk about these urban refugee issues. And so they were encouraging UNHCR to do that much more proactively. There are organizations like ILO, UN Habitat, and local NGOs and development actors that can actually bring a lot to the table, and UNHCR really hasn't tapped into those group of people before. They've also, another recommendation was ensuring that refugees are aware of their responsibilities as well as their rights to foster good relations with the local community, and ensuring that the host community also benefits from refugee programming. And I think that that's really important. We've seen really good work by UNHCR in Colombia, for example, where they have youth centers, kind of similar to the ones you described that I visited, where it's not just a refugee youth center, it's a youth center in a city, and anyone can come and access it. And that's fostered a lot of really goodwill between it's more on IDPs, but between the internally displaced people and the local population. So we have seen that has really helped in trying to ensure that the host community, there's buy-in within the host community to be able to provide services to refugees. Lastly, in terms of recommendations, they emphasized ensuring that refugee voices are heard and that their input is included in programming. And to me, this is the most important. We often disregard the voices of youth in particular in participatory exercises. It's almost a checkboxing exercise. And they often are actually the ones who have the most to say and the ones who have the most innovative ideas. So we will be following up on a lot of those recommendations this year and trying to figure out how we can move forward and strengthen our partners, including especially UNHCR's programming. I just wanted to highlight one thing. In 2011, Secretary Clinton signed a Department of State Youth Policy Framework that is accessible on our website. And it reinforces that the State Department should pursue 3 primary strategies. The first is advancing youth issues, including education, economic empowerment, and civic participation in our bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. The second is empowering young people, and particularly as economic and political actors with skills and networks through our programming. And third is engaging in honest two-way dialogue with young people and involving them directly in our policy processes. We have an Office of Global Youth Issues, and they're working on implementation of that strategy. And if you have any specific questions on this new strategy or in the Global Youth Office, let me know and I'll put you in touch with the director there. So as you can see, PRM has been very, very committed to continuing to support the work of our partners, both through strengthening programming for urban populations, but also ensuring that adolescents and youths are full partners, participants, and recipients of this support. Given that over 40% of the world's population is under the age of 25, we feel that it is incumbent on all of us to increase our efforts to meet these needs of adolescents and youth and secure their healthy transition to adulthood. So, thank you.
I would like to begin by thanking the Woodrow Wilson International Center and Women Refugee Commission for giving an NGO from New Delhi, India, to be here and give a field perspective. India hosts a population of more than 300,000 refugees. Out of that, 100,000 are from Tibet and 17,000 are under the mandate of UNHCR. And we also have 68,000 refugees from Sri Lanka. Don Bosco works with refugees that are under the mandate of UNHCR. Out of the 17,000 refugees that we have, 9,000 are Afghans, 7,000 from Myanmar, and 1,000 from other nationals. We also work with 5,000 asylum seekers in New Delhi. The Afghan refugees that came to India in 1981 first, and 90% of them are Hindu and Sikh Afghans. The rest are Muslim Afghans, whom we call the ethnic Afghans. Then we have 7,000 refugees from Myanmar, and they came first in the year 1989, and most of the refugees from Myanmar, they look like our own Indians from Northeast states. Of the 1,000 refugees of other nationalities, 900 are from Somalia, and the rest are from other countries like Sudan, Eritrea, Congo, and Iran, Iraq. Don Bosco has been working with the refugee population from the last 10 years, and we believe that a bundle of belongings is not just the thing that a refugee brings to a new country. A refugee, when he comes to a new country, has his own hopes and aspirations, has a set of skills, and it is just not a statistical number where we call a refugee by AF 101 or BU 232. There is much more to a refugee, a lot of skills, a lot of hopes, a lot of aspirations apart from the trauma that one has gone through. When we started working with the refugee youth, we initially started by just offering them language classes because they wanted to learn English. We offered them computer classes, not because it was of much use to them, but because youth like to work on computers. And we had a group of Afghan youth who were very frustrated because of their long stay in New Delhi. So when we got together with them, it was they all come together and get a place where they can all have Afghan tea. That was how we started working with them, because it was difficult for us to gain their trust initially. There was so much of mistrust and a lot of issues with them. So we gave them a place where they could all come together. And once they came together, our social workers and psychologists, caseworkers started interacting with them to understand them better. And of all the nationalities together, some of the common issues of the refugee youth were language and poverty. In New Delhi, the most common language that everybody speaks is Hindi, apart from English. Poverty, because of it is an urban setting where people have to pay for their rents, people have to pay for food, to commute, to transport. Lack of education, lot of cultural difference. Delhi is a place with 16.3 million population, where people from different states of India migrate to Delhi for better economic reasons. So it's a very dynamic place, and it doesn't have a culture of its own. It's a mixed culture of different states of India. Lack of identity, no place to belong, identity crisis, and a lot of anxiety about their future. So once we started interacting with the youth, we came up with youth clubs. At the moment, we have 11 youth clubs, where each club is led by 4 leaders, 2 male and 2 females. And these 11 clubs are located in different parts of Delhi. The club composition basically depends on the people that live in one geographical area come together. At time it is youth from a single nationality, and there are also youth groups that have mixed nationalities. And all these youth clubs, every month these leaders get together. We have a leadership skills training for them, and we choose a theme on which we train them. And we give them some funds to go out into the community and carry out campaigns. And the next month, the clubs come and they share with us what did they do for their community. There are a lot of life skills training that happens. Sports and recreation, definitely they have a sports meet. Every year they have a youth event where they come and showcase their traditional dance and songs. They also carry out a lot of community campaigns on education, sexual and gender-based violence, HIV/AIDS. And there is a component of having 30% local Indians in the youth club. So it helps to build good rapport with the local Indians, because that's a big issue in New Delhi. The relationship with the local Indians is not very great, because you compete for the same things, like even if it is drinking water, if it is getting places on rent, so you compete for the same thing. So the relationship is not so great. So these youth clubs help to bridge that gap. They also reach out to the elderly and the disabled in the community. And there is also a provision where the youth clubs can come up with a social project. They send us a proposal, we study and we sanction, and the youth themselves carry out these social projects. It could be something like having self-defense classes for the girls in the community. It could be learning guitar or learning your own language in a new place like Delhi. With regard to education, in New Delhi, refugees have access to government school facilities, but then the medium of instruction in these schools is Hindi, and refugees are not very keen to learn Hindi. They want to go to English medium schools. So there are government schools that are English medium, but those are limited. And there is also a need for a certain amount of documentation. That's where we help them to get that documentation done. We also support them with tuition classes and help them to cope with Hindi. There are also a lot of school dropouts that have done their 7th grade and 8th grade. So in Delhi, we have a system of distance learning called the National Open School Program, where they can do their studies through a distance learning program. But even with regard to that, they require support in terms of tuitions. And it is a very popular means of pursuing one's education, because it gives a refugee youth flexibility to study. You can out of the 5 subjects, you can do 2 subjects at one time, and you can do the rest 3 later on. And you can also support your family members with regard to work, and you can support them. So that's very popular. Then we also have very limited option for pursuing higher education after 12th grade. There is a Duffy scholarship by the German embassy. where children, youth are helped to pursue their higher education. But those are very limited, and one of the preconditions to avail a DAFE scholarship is that you should have already taken admission in a course. So that leaves a lot of meritorious youth who do not have funds to pursue their higher education still wanting to do that. With regard to vocational training, we have English language and Hindi language skills training for them. English, most of them want to learn. Hindi, very few want to learn because they feel that Hindi won't be of use to them once they go back to their own country or if they are resettled to a third country. Then we also offer basic computer and advanced computer in our own centers. For the other courses, we link them to the different institutes. We sponsor them to different institutes for courses that would help them to get some employment during their stay in New Delhi. So these could be hospitality, retail management, hardware networking courses. Then we also have a very strong component of psychosocial support in our program because most of the refugee youth have gone through a lot of trauma back home, and they also have a lot of coping issues during their stay in New Delhi. So we do make home visits for them, have counseling support. We also have a tie-up with a mental health hospital for refugees that would require psychiatric interventions. And we also put them into institutional care if there are cases of de-addiction. It's very challenging to work with refugees that are single. Refugees that have family support, it's much easier for us to work with them in case of mental health. Otherwise, there is a strong chance that they'll abuse the medicines, or once they are back from the de-addiction, they do relapse. So we try and link them with the community as well. Then we also have a component of occupational therapy in our program where refugees come to our centers and they are monitored daily. So in the occupational therapy, refugees are involved in making paper bags, paper plate, candle making. And at this time, we do look at the refugees in a holistic way. We look at their families, what are the other ways in which they can be helped. And they are either sponsored to the different courses that I spoke about, or they are trained on skills like knitting, weaving, tailoring. And they do make certain products in our production centers, and we market them under the brand name Koshish. Koshish in Delhi means an effort. And it is also very challenging for us to market these products because in New Delhi, a lot of cheap labor is available because of a lot of migrants from different states of India. So it's really challenging to market these products as well. So we do put up stalls in different embassies and schools and colleges. Our main area of work is livelihood, where after getting these training sponsorships, we try and place them into different jobs. So we do a market survey where we find out what are the kind of skills that are required for refugees. A refugee can come and register with us as job seeker. We do a job seekers training, accompany them for interviews, and also do a post-placement follow-up to make sure that they're doing well in their job and they get their wages on time. We also have workshops with the employers. We have an employers meet where we try and sensitize them about refugees and also take feedback from them about. It is challenging to place refugees in New Delhi because a lot of labor is cheaply available. So for us to negotiate better salaries for refugees it's a big challenge. Then we had Women Refugee Commission with us last year where they came for an assessment, and they gave us also a lot of recommendations. So one of the major recommendation was to move from a protection model to a self-reliance model. So it was only after their recommendation that we had this occupational therapy separated from the income generation activities, and slowly the refugees are phased out to work in the job market. We also have a provision to help refugees to start a small business. So we do not give them the funds, we help them to kind of buy things that helps them to set up their small business, and we also help them with business skills training, financial literacy classes, and quite a number of the small business grants have been successful. And from this year, we have a component of livelihood projects where instead of an individual, a group of refugees can come together and start a small business. At the moment, there are two community projects running, both by Myanmar refugees, where they run a tuition and a daycare center. We also have a population of unaccompanied and separated children in New Delhi, and they live with people from their same community. They are without their families, so we call them caregivers, and they end up giving these caregivers all the subsistence allowance that they get from UNHCR, and also end up doing all the household work, babysitting for the families because of the favor they render on them, even when they are asylum seekers. So to motivate these youth to come and avail the services, we have a special program called Learn and Train, where they come and spend the day with us and get an incentive for us from us. Half day they learn English, computer, or National Open School, and half a day they are involved in creative activities like making coasters or cards and things like that. And we also sensitize the caregivers by doing workshops with them. And we especially try and monitor the unaccompanied minors in the age group of 17 plus, because by the time they turn 18, the assistance that they get from UNHCR stops. So they have to find some means to work. And life skills training again is a very major component of our work. The challenges that we face with our work, the cultural barriers that the refugees have. New Delhi is not very kind to refugees, especially people from Somalia. They are discriminated a lot. Even though the Myanmar refugees look quite similar to people from our northeast, still they're discriminated because their culture is very different from culture of New Delhi. To save rent, a lot of Myanmar refugees, boys and girls, they stay together, say 10 people in a small room. In New Delhi, that's not very common, where unrelated boys and girls don't stay together. Their dressing, their food habits are very different. So there are a lot of cultural barriers. Very, very limited scope to pursue higher education. UNHCR has done a lot of advocacy work with universities and colleges to accept refugees as Indians. Otherwise, the fee for foreign nationals is much higher. So even if they acknowledge the certificates or the documentation for the refugees, still there are no means apart from the few scholarships that we have to help the students to pursue their higher education. Then very limited recreational opportunities for them. There are no parks where they can play. It's a challenge. Then till now, refugees did not have work permit or long-term visas. It's now after a lot of advocacy work that they started issuing long-term visas with work permits. It's still on papers. It will take a long time to actually come into the field where refugees would actually have work permits. So for us to place them in the informal job market is possible, but it's very challenging to place a doctor as a doctor, to place an engineer as an engineer. And how do you offer a doctor to work as a salesman or an engineer to work at a reception? So those are very, very challenging areas for us. And there are also very limited options for banking and saving accounts. We 2 years back managed to open a lot of bank accounts for the refugees, but due to the change in by the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, those accounts were closed. So refugees do not have bank accounts, but of late recently we've managed to get ATM cards issued for them, where they can where all the payments that go to refugees can go through these rechargeable cards. So this was just a small glimpse into the work that we at Don Bosco do. Thank you.
Well, as I promised, we had 3 very interesting presentations, and presentations which fit together quite nicely, as we've heard a little bit about international principles and practices. We've heard a little bit about mid-level engagement, and then we've also heard very specific stories about what happens on the street. So I think the panel has provided something of a holistic opening for discussing issues. So let me see what questions there are. And I need to be sure someone is handling the microphones. And since the first microphone is over there, we're going to go here first, and then we'll move around the room. So, not yet, Patricia. We're going to go here. And then I have Patricia over here, and I have one person back here. Did I see two hands? One person back there. Okay. Go ahead
Hello.
and identify yourself.
Okay. Hello. Hi, my name is Cordelia Chestnut. I'm with the World Bank program on forced displacement. We're a little trust fund in the World Bank that tries to mainstream issues of forced displacement within the work of the World Bank. I had two questions. First of all, thank you for 3 excellent presentations. It was really nice to get a sense. We have engaged with the Women's Refugees Commission before, but to hear more about your recent report and your work was very engaging. And I had 2 questions. First of all, to Mr. Chatnan, and then afterwards to Ms. Gaitner. Hopefully, I'm not mispronouncing your names too badly. First of all, Mr. Chattan, you talked about a variety of issues regarding urban displacement, and I was wondering the data. I'm finding it hard to find reliable data on how many people we have in the different cities. Recently, I was doing a survey of refugees and displaced people within the largest cities of the world, and I'm trying to find, what's the cutoff when we look at significant displacement? What are we looking at? The 10,000 people, 1,000 people, and where do you get your information from? You were around doing interviews, but what are the websites and sort of the information you rely on? And then the second question to Ms. Gaitner was, you were talking about how there's this divide between humanitarian responses and perhaps on the longer term developmental issues in terms of short term, medium, long term. And most of the engagement we talked about today was on UNHCR, which of course is a humanitarian agency. I'm coming from the developmental stages, thinking that most refugees are in protracted displacement situations that are not just, short term, but a very long term. And we're all talking about livelihoods, and this is a long term issue. So if you could talk a little bit about whether you engage with developmental issues or agencies, and how the thinking is within the agency.
Okay, why don't we respond to these questions?
Data is a huge challenge. We mostly rely on UNHCR figures for data, and that is generally only a reflection of their caseload, which we know and they know isn't the whole picture. But the estimates that you get, depends on the city, but I'm just thinking the Nairobi example. I think writing up our report, I found estimates from like 31,000 to 200,000. So, and sometimes by the same agency over time. And in some of these settings, the numbers have grown dramatically in recent years, so nobody really knows. I guess I'm not giving you a good answer, I'm sorry, but I can share with you the sources that we have for the cities that we looked at.
Thank you, and it's a very, very good question. It's something that we struggle with every day, how to sort of bridge this relief to development gap. And there isn't an easy answer. I think UNHCR works on protracted situations and has been working in a lot of these refugee emergencies, not really emergencies, for years and not tens and thousands, but tens of years. So 30, 40 years in some refugee situations. But we have been sort of looking at this whole relief to development gap within the U.S. government, but as part of the QDDR, and don't ask me how to spell it out because I'm going to mess it up, but it's the sort of the largest sort of U.S. government. It's a policy to see how the humanitarian State Department and AID are working more closely together. So it's a new sort of approach in the last couple of years. And within that QDDR, we have been talking to the development side of the U.S. government on how to ensure that refugees are integrated into larger development programs and policies. And also working with host governments to make sure that refugees that aren't probably going to be going home anytime soon are incorporated into national government plans and programs. Have we been 100% successful? Probably not, but I think we're really trying to look at different ways of sort of ensuring that refugees and conflict-affected populations are included. We work very closely with, although my colleague just left, with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. They also do, they're in USAID, but do more of the humanitarian piece, but have helped us a lot sort of gain an entry into the more development, the development side of AID. So there are some interesting programs that we've been able to work jointly with them on. Thanks.
We have a microphone back there, so we'll go there, but we can, if you can bring the microphone up here, we'll take these two questions later. Go ahead.
Yeah. Judy Mayotte, and I go way back to the founding of the Women's Refugee Commission, so I'm an old lady. And I also was once in PRM, so with Phyllis Oakley, so and have worked with refugees for a long, long time. And I think, and I want to thank all of you for your wonderful presentations, but also for the wonderful work that each one of you do and the dedication that you have to these issues, because they're critically important. And I think I'm going to pose my question to you from Don Bosco, Celine, but the others can come in. I wonder, when you're dealing, I mean, most of you have been talking about refugees much more than you have IDPs, which I understand, but I'd like to know some of the differentiation as far as working in urban settings in regard to IDPs and the refugees. And then the second thing that I specifically want to address to you is the issue of xenophobia. That is rife in many of the cities. I have lived in South Africa for the last 7 years and was there during the xenophobic violence there, and wonder how you of Don Bosco on the ground are working with that kind of issue, as well as language barrier, and as well as any of the issues that the violence that continues on against many of these refugees who come in from other countries.
New Delhi definitely hosts refugees apart from people of different diverse cultures from different parts of India. And refugees, they tend to gauge the areas where they even find accommodation. So for example, we find the Somalis and the ethnic Afghans, they tend to find accommodation in Muslim-dominated areas in New Delhi, whereas the refugees from Myanmar, who are very poor as compared to the other two populations, they tend to find accommodation in places that are much cheaper, which means that those places are not very well recognized areas or colonies, as we call them in New Delhi. So they are also at much more risk of sexual and gender-based violence. So across Delhi, though refugees can practice their own religion in New Delhi, so that's a good thing about New Delhi. They can practice their own religion and their own culture. But definitely the relationships with the local Indians is not so great. It's very challenging. So with the youth clubs, we are able to bridge the gap between the youth. In the schools, we are trying to orient the school teachers and the principals, because even they are not aware about who refugees are. And there are a lot of myths about refugees. Anybody who comes to New Delhi from any other state, if you are not coming there for work as a high-profile person, everybody will call you a refugee, even if you come for economic reasons. So people are not able to differentiate who a refugee really is. So that's a gap we are trying to bridge by sensitizing the youth, and also this year we've tried to have sessions with the local women, so that we get the refugee and the local women together. They come together for a session. We talk about something that is interesting for them, a simple thing like putting henna on their hands, so that they are at least interested to come, and we also give them a small memento so that they take it back home and speak to their husbands about refugees. So those are different ways that we try to bridge the gap. But most of the people are not aware about refugees. Even when we go to government schools, even the hospitals where they have free access. So at times people really wonder that why does an NGO need to handhold a refugee with regard to documentation, or why do they need interpreters in the hospitals. So this year we've tried, because health and education has been new areas for us this year. So we've tried to kind of sensitize the we have a session with the government hospital doctors after I go back from here. We've just had with the government school principals and teachers. So most people are not aware about refugees.
Okay, we have two questions here where the microphone is. We'll go to Patricia first and then the next woman, and then we'll go back. We can get the microphone in the back of the room.
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. My questions are very much in the spirit of the first two questioners, I would say, all of them perhaps. And in one sentence, the question is, what is the end game here when it comes to dealing with urban refugees as a subject at the table? But in fact, I don't think anybody at this table, because you're all very smart, you all gave wonderful presentations, and you know a lot about it, I don't think anybody would make a simplistic division between refugees on the one side and economic migrants on the other as migrants to city, because so many of the migrants are forced to be there just as the refugees are, albeit the truth that refugees do have particular problems that other populations would not, and some that aren't, some that are different. But in defining the end game, I think that that would help defining the priorities of what sort of services to give. If the end game is, as is always assumed for refugees, falsely and sometimes in truth, that they're going back to their countries of origin, maybe, maybe not, that they're going to be resettled, many times not in large numbers, although they hope that they will be, that they're going to stay where they are, that they're going to move someplace else. I mean, if the end game is integration into the city, which it seems to me is often true, then that dictates a list of priorities that might differ from the priorities that would be the case were the refugees preparing for resettlement or preparing for repatriation. So I'd really like to see some addressing that, as well as you've all done a great job segmenting the population. There's youth and there's women, and they're all the segmented groups within the refugee population. But I think it's important to know your end game as you're defining your program. Thank you.
And let's get the second question before we answer.
Lucinda Fleeson from the University of Maryland College of Journalism and the International Center for Journalists. Just a point of reference, Josh, and I just couldn't hear or miss the reference. You said the biggest issue with refugees is ... adolescent women. Can you just fill in the blanks there and expand a little bit?
Yeah,
adolescent girls.
I can't quantify it. But it's a gigantic issue. The proliferation of women and girls who work in people's homes, the homes of others, as domestic workers. It's really hard to work with that population because they're functionally invisible, and they don't have a voice, and their rights are trampled.
And why is it the biggest issue?
I mean, again, I don't know if it's the biggest issue. It's a huge issue that people haven't tackled. There are population councils done some really neat work to try to work with employers to get access to the girls and give the girls a platform, a place where they can make friends and get an ID card and get access to health education and just basic rights education, that kind of thing. And they work with employers to create a set of standard operating procedures and a job description and that kind of thing. This has been done somewhere in India and a couple other places I can share with you that work. Really neat stuff.
Okay, why don't we take what is from where you sort of are sitting? What is the end game? We'll start with Salim and move down the table.
Refugees definitely are in New Delhi for a long, long time. Even when they come there, even if they think that it's for a short time, they end up being there for a long time, which they really do not want. Many of them assume that when they come to New Delhi, they'll be resettled very easily in a few months, in a few years. But that's not the fact. Only 1% of refugees get resettled, and you have refugees living in New Delhi for 10 years, 20 years. Earlier, the mindset was that I will not avail the opportunities that are available. I will go to a third country, or I'll go back. If the situation improves, then I'll send my children to school. Then I will learn a skill, then I'll do. But now, after a long time, they've understood that they're there for a long time. So it makes sense to send small children to school rather than keeping them in homes and thinking that we'll do it when we go to a third country. So there is a lot of realization that refugees are there for a long, long time, and they are making efforts in the population that we have. Only the Hindu and Sikh Afghans have the opportunity to apply for Indian citizenship. The rest of them do continue as refugees till a durable solution is found for them. But still, now we find that more refugees are making use of the opportunities that are available to them.
I think you put it very well. I mean, I think generally the end game will depend on the populations that we're dealing with. But in many instances, the refugee situations are very protracted. So for us, the end game is to ensure that refugees actually have access to basic services and services that the the local population receive. I think, again, it's very country dependent and situation dependent, but refugees aren't, for the most part, don't necessarily go home very quickly. So it's, basic, it sounds judgmental, but basic care and maintenance and support to these populations and ensuring that they are appropriately assisted and protected and that they have a voice, especially in urban situations where they seem to fall through the cracks. So it's, I don't know, Josh.
Yeah, I have a yes and answer. I mean, to continue with that, and I really like your question, Patricia. There are a few of us in this space, and I think you might be one of them, who are starting to think about urban refugees as just, and IDPs, as just another factor to consider in the urban poverty ecosystem, right? So we've done, there are those who argue that the work we've done as humanitarian enterprise on trying to meet the needs of refugees, IDPs in some cases, is so much window dressing, because we can, for example, the advocacy work that UNHCR does with governments. It's painfully difficult to do, and we get not very far often. And governments don't have much incentive to care about the needs of refugees. So there are those that argue that we should instead flip this whole thing upside down and start thinking about way down local at the neighborhood level and saying, what can we do for micro local economic development for people, like be they refugees or whoever, and once we can get the incentives right at the local level, where, for example, refugee women are having to trade sex for access to a parking space that's controlled by the local taxi rank. There's all these weird bylaws and incentives at the micro level that we're not thinking about, we're not doing anything about. So why not think way out of the box and start down at that micro level, trying to get the incentives right in one place, and then move it around to the rest of the city, little by little. It's a lot, I'm acknowledging, it's a lot easier to say this than it is to do it, and it's a completely different approach. Last time we talked about this the other day in another meeting, and it was, the room erupted, and we can't do this, we can't take this approach. So I'm not saying it's easy, and I don't have a framework for it, but I do think that it's got a lot of potential.
Okay, we have a question in the back. If we can get the gentleman a microphone. Are there other people who are going to want to have questions? We'll have a microphone ready up here too. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Patrick Crump from Save the Children, and my question was partially answered, which was concerning these domestic workers. Where do you start? Because they don't have a meeting place. They're invisible. But but Josh, you started to answer that. So since I've got the microphone, I'll maybe it's not a question so much as we at Save the Children, you referenced the report we just released, which was really acknowledging that we have, as an NGO, traditionally been working in rural settings and are very familiar with working with ministries and government services and communities, and we're just trying to come to grips with how do you work in an urban environment where you have a whole different set of players, you have municipalities, et cetera. So thinking about how to work with urban refugees is sort of probably 100 miles ahead for us. We're looking at how do we work with youth in urban settings in general, and how do you engage municipalities to ensure that those people get services. So, this is a very interesting topic, but for us, I think, for a lot of the sort of the development community, I think that the issues are not just urban youth refugees, but urban youth in general.
Okay, and let's take the other second question or comment right here, and identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Holland Hammond. I work at Creative Associates right now, but I'm also a graduate student at GW. Most of my experience with refugees has been in a camp setting, in protracted refugee camp setting in Kakuma. But I'm wondering, one of the things I've noticed and read in a lot of your research is about how youth, especially displaced youth, crave some sort of recognition and some sort of power and want to be recognized for being decision makers and change makers in communities. But what I've found and learned is that a lot of these idle youth don't know how to sort of engage themselves in programs that are even offered, such as the ones that we're talking about, which sounds so wonderful. So how do you extract those youth who have become sort of, sometimes we label them as lazy or just idle or not really doing anything with their lives or seeming that way. So how do we extract them from that sort of mindset and get them engaged in these programs, actually get them to come to the youth centers and take on some sort of part of this community? So what are some strategies to actually pull them in? So whether it's incentives or making it very attractive for them, sort of my question for any of you.
Okay.
Thank
Why
you
don't
for your
we start?
presentation.
We'll go down the table again, and both questions are on the table.
I'll just give you an example. We had to do sessions on, say, HIV/AIDS to kind of teach them. So it's so boring to talk about HIV/AIDS. I mean, you get everybody together and you tell them how is HIV/AIDS transmitted, what are the precautions, and you should not discriminate against HIV positive people. So we realized that when we started doing it, not many were interested, and we do it every year. So we started linking it with a sports meet. So we all wear t-shirts saying that let's unite to fight against HIV/AIDS. There is a trophy, so everybody, we have a competition around that. It's a poster making competition, it's a slogan writing competition among these youth club members. So that was an initiative that we took, and we found that there were so many youth who wanted to come and participate, like 1,000 youth participated in the HIV/AIDS awareness campaign. So it really depends on finding the interest of the youth, and also to a large extent, because they've gone through so much of trauma, being their personal friends in a way that they trust you. Do something what the youth like to do, and then pass on the key messages and involve them in activities that you really want to. Otherwise, you tell youth to reach out to the elderly people in the community, that would be the most boring thing for them to do. But you link it with an incentive, make it creative, sensitize them about the elderly, and they'll be very happy to do it. So it involves a lot of rapport building with the youth, working with them, understanding their mindsets, and doing things a little different, which makes it interesting for them.
Yeah. A few thoughts. Sports is a huge one. Kids want to play sports. Peer outreach is something that we hear a lot. Like when programs have been successful, they've often engaged young people who are particularly motivated, kind of connector youth, to reach out to other youth and get them engaged. The big one for me in my work is livelihoods programming. So often a group will have, an NGO will have identify a problem issue like gender-based violence or HIV/AIDS or some issue that they want to tackle, and they'll start their program and they'll have disappointing uptake at the community level. And about year 2, they say, let's add some kind of livelihood, like economic strengthening intervention to this program. It happens over and over and over and over and over again because families and young people themselves, like I said, are time poor, and if there's not the perception of a near-term economic benefit from their participation, they may not be interested. So,
And I think just asking them what interests them, and then using that as the entry point is always really useful.
We have time for a couple of questions. We'll take these 3 questions, and then I'll begin to wrap up. Let's get the microphone here first, and then we'll pick up these 2 folks here.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Politz. I'm a youth and community strategy consultant. I've been working for 40 years, both domestically and internationally, on youth issues. And I think there are incredible opportunities in response to the most recent question and others to be tapping into the long-standing work of organizations here in the U.S. that have been working with some very similar populations. Yes, I can't say refugees would be maybe defined exactly the same way, but even here in D.C. at the Latin American Youth Center, they've been working with young people who have been refugees from El Salvador and coming unaccompanied and working with them for almost 40 years, incredibly successfully and comprehensive, both community building, workforce development, education approaches, where now these, so many stories. But there are organizations like this, and the opportunity to think about some global discussions where we're taking lessons learned both internationally back here and domestically to the international front, with young people at the core of what's made the positive difference for them when they experience some of the same things. I think there's lots of opportunities to build on this.
Let's take the 2 questions here.
As you take that, just to mention that we resettle a lot of refugees into the U.S. as well, and have had a lot of success of building bridges between the resettled refugees here and then those urban and camp-based youth overseas, and trying to look at lessons learned and things that have worked here. Or once the refugees resettled here, they might have some really innovative ideas to be able to translate overseas. So we've definitely started to look at those linkages.
Hi, my name is Daniel Friedman. I work with the Department of State's Office of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. One subject that you all touched on was the role of youth centers and the role that they can play. In a couple of the different engagements that our office has, we've been working pretty closely with some youth centers. Actually, a few of them are run by Creative Associates, so we've had the chance to see some of those. And as Josh mentioned, there can be a very wide range as far as the level of participation, the types of services that they provide. One challenge that we've encountered is, again, as was mentioned, youth, depending on the area, can often be subject to the roles of gangs, pressures of gang violence, and we found that sometimes even the most successful and active youth centers, the gangs actually can then play a role in determining who's allowed to go, determining who can have the access to the services provided, even when they're fully functioning, also using as a base for operations for other criminal activities. I was wondering if that's something that you've ever encountered and what tactics and strategies have been done to deal with that.
And there was another hand over here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Radha Rajkotia with the International Rescue Committee. And I had, I guess, 2 questions, maybe just one. So we've been running livelihoods programs for youth. Some of the pictures are in Josh's presentation, which are great to see, with Somali refugee girls in Nairobi, and also with Kenyan girls living there. Really great program, showing great results. And I guess the main question that I have is that we understand, we've learned from that the great effects that livelihoods can have on protection. So whether it's bringing girls out of domestic servitude, whether it's building social capital amongst them, or providing them access to services through just the money that they now have in their pockets. That's all great, but where's the audience now for this? You know, where amongst, it feels like we're in a room of friendly faces and kind of, you know, friendly ears in some to some regard, but where does this conversation go beyond the people who are in this room and the stakeholders and officers represented here? So if we're thinking about promoting good practice and advocacy, where should our external targets beyond this room be?
Okay, why don't we start with Josh, and we'll move towards Salim, and you can answer both questions and make any final observations you want to make.
Youth centers being run by gangs, we do not advocate that. We like condemn that in the strongest terms. But yeah, things can go wrong whenever people get into groups. It happens a lot with community policing as well. Will turn into I don't know, an armed gang. But I don't have any experience with trying to do anything about it. Do you?
We haven't faced such issues as you mentioned, but yes, we also have a lot of try and take support from the community, but that again is very risky because, for example, the Afghans at times do not like the mixing of boys and girls, which they do in our youth clubs. Then when you speak about safe sex, they say Don Bosco promotes sex. So there are issues like this that we encounter, but nothing like gangs or things like that.
Okay, Josh, do you have any final observations in general? You don't have to.
The what's the audience for this, Radha? You're supposed to tell me. You work in D.C. Joan, you work in D.C. Do you have thoughts on this?
I think one of the takeaways for me about what the audience is it's the humanitarian and development worlds coming together. It was very interesting to hear the comment, I think, about experiences in the U.S. or possibly other countries that are dealing with populations that may not be refugees but have come there for different reasons with very similar things. And so to me, it's really busting out of the traditional silos. Then you have to think about the traditional funding streams and all of that and how you begin to open those up so that they can match some of the creative, holistic kind of programming you need. So I guess, I'm actually a little encouraged that this room has kind of a bigger cross-section than you sometimes see if you hold a meeting about refugees. And so to me, if we could build on this and look at the cross-section of that's here in this room and think about what that implies for the advocacy we do around programming and funding, that's a place to start, I think.
Okay. Any other final comments? I want to wrap up and maybe provide something of my own take on the answer to your question. It seems to me this has been a very rich discussion and an important discussion. And Nicole, in her presentation, said 58% of refugees are in urban areas. And that means we have to think about what does it mean that they're in cities? How is it different that they're in cities? And I think Josh talked in the beginning about the need to convert the image of refugees from that of a threat into that of an opportunity. And I think this is where the urban context becomes important. For that to happen, a number of different steps need to be taken. Part has to do with exactly the kinds of programming Celine has been talking about. The need to create trust, the need to create clubs, the need to create opportunities in which refugees and refugee youth come into contact with a broader society around them. Because in reality, for many of the people we're talking about, they're going to be in place for a very long time. And the more they're connected in a city with the outside community, the better. So there are ways in which you can think differently about having refugees in cities connect with a broader community. But there's also the problem of threat, because refugees are different. They're poor, young people, poor people, youth are people that municipal authorities around the world love to ignore. They would just as soon that they go away. When you sit down and talk to mayors around the world about what their number one priority is, it's jobs, it's economic development. And when you start talking about refugees and you start talking about poor people, you start talking about the specter of perhaps violence, these are people who get in the way of the mayor's agenda to create jobs. There is, at the moment, a global pushback since 2008 against participation by many municipal bureaucracies around the world. How can you talk about inclusion when the people running cities begin by saying, this participation stuff, we can't afford it anymore. It was nice when there was money, but since the financial crisis, there's no money and it's just a waste of time. That's with their own citizens. And this is where I think the urban context becomes important, because there are always different players in the urban context, and we need to think creatively about how to engage players who normally you wouldn't think at all might be allies in some of these issues. And I want to give 4 very concrete examples that I know about, not so much with youth, but with immigrants, to show that sometimes in an urban context, you suddenly have allies you never considered. The one example I don't actually have personal experience with, but we just had a session here on mitigating violence in Colombian cities with 3 Colombian mayors. Turns out the police are great allies in reaching out to communities because they're the people on the front line and they realize they can't begin to confront violence unless they are engaged in communities. Public health officials. I know in the Ukrainian city of Odessa, where there's a large migrant population, public health officials who were trying to struggle with drug abuse and HIV/AIDS were the ones who said, we have to understand that these people live here. We can't ignore the fact that there are tens of thousands of people we don't consider to be in residence here actually here, and we can't do our job unless they're part of the picture. Businesses. In the city of Yekaterinburg, where there's a labor shortage, which admittedly makes this a little bit different, the major people pushing for services to integrate new migrants to the cities were businesses because they needed labor. And school teachers, the case of Kiev, where they weren't officially refugees, but families were coming from Afghanistan in particular, but also from Iraq, and they were totally, their existence was denied by all the city officials until school teachers started saying, I don't know who these kids are in my class, but I have to do something with them. So I think when you look at the urban context, you can begin to look for allies you don't normally think of. And that's where I think the underlying theme that I've heard here, the need to create trust, the need to create engagement, the need to move from the notion of protection to sort of self-promotion becomes very, very important. And I'll leave with a favorite story of mine, although it's a little bit disconnected, but not completely. Because it has to do with Tajiks in the Russian city of Yekaterinburg, which is right on the dividing line between Europe and Asia. And the Tajiks there, the civil war in Tajikistan had been over about a decade, but the Tajiks who were there because of the effects of the war. And they're largely construction workers. And after the 2008 financial crisis, they were working on buildings which the construction stopped. And one particular company owner said, well, I'm not going to pay you. So this also brings in technology. These are young male construction workers. They organize a hunger strike. One of them happened to know a BBC reporter. The BBC reporter did a story about how these Tajik construction workers are out on the streets and it's -30 and they have a hunger strike. The president of Tajikistan was in Switzerland doing God knows what and saw the BBC report and called Russian President Medvedev on his cell phone saying, what are you doing to my people? And Medvedev, of course, got in touch with local officials. That's an interesting part of the story, but the next stage is interesting, even more interesting. The Tajik workers were paid, they collected their money, and they bought the company that didn't pay them. I think in that story there are lots of lessons about why it is that kind of enabling people to promote themselves and defend themselves is really, really important, and it's particularly important when you begin to move into urban contexts where there are a lot of people they need to protect themselves from. So I want to thank all the speakers. It's been a great talk, and I want to thank all of you, and we hope to see you again.